Hello everybody, my name is Michael Andriano and this is my presentation about inclusion in higher education. So why higher education? Well, whether serving as the vehicle of one's ambitions or a rite of passage in today's modern world, higher education stands as a keystone of human achievement with its ability to create professionals and new knowledge alongside them. For many, attending higher education seems to be a lofty goal and succeeding within it an even loftier one. For some people, university classes are viewed as being held in ivory towers among individuals with which they do not belong. This fallacy is the burden of many prospective students, but it is even heavier for those with disabilities. I myself struggle with disabilities, and I work with many middle school and high school students who do as well. I have heard from them that perhaps college is not for them due to the disabilities that they have. This hurts me because I know firsthand how painful this self-doubt is. I also know that with the right support systems and scaffolding in place, higher education really can be for anyone. I am interested in this area of focus because I would love to work within higher education, whether as a professor or someone working behind the curtain to ensure that professors and students have what they each need to foment success. So firstly, who are these students? And that brings us to demographics. Luckily, we live in a country with a government that cares about collecting data regarding the population of students in higher education who have disabilities. This data has been collected by the Department of Education using surveys. According to the data presented, 19.4% of all sampled students pursuing undergraduate degrees reported having a disability. Furthermore, out of a sample of post-baccalaureate students, a lot of big words in here, the percentage of students with disabilities drops to 11.9%. Female students overall were more likely to report having a disability than male students in both the undergraduate and post-baccalaureate categories. In both subsets, Asians were least likely to report having a disability. The racial category of American Indian/Alaska Native showed the highest percentage of reported disabilities for undergraduates, and Pacific Islanders had the highest percentage of reported disabilities in the post-baccalaureate student population. The survey also categorized the respondents into 3 age groups. According to the results, all higher education students are more likely to report having a disability as they get older. Lastly, students who are veterans are significantly more likely to report having a disability than non-veteran students. While I looked for data regarding completion rates for students with disabilities in higher education, data from the Department of Education attested that such data was categorically difficult to accumulate. They were, however, able to discover that students with disabilities are more likely to experience a negative and even hostile educational environment. According to their data, students with disabilities are more likely to feel uncomfortable in classes, uncomfortable within their department, and uncomfortable on campus than students without disabilities. One interesting statistic that I've noticed echoed in both reports is that students in graduate programs are less likely to report having a disability. Is this due to less students with disabilities pursuing post-baccalaureate endeavors? Or are their students simply less likely to report having a disability? It's an important distinction that gives us different pictures of the population that is being thought of. If the former, then how can I, as a future staff member at a higher education institution, inspire more students with disabilities to pursue such programs? If the latter, then what factors come into play in influencing them not to report having a disability? Economic data and challenges. According to data compiled by the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, people of working age, between 16 and 64, were about twice as likely to experience unemployment in 2019 than people of the same age group who did not have a disability. This finding is consistent across all 3 metrics used by the Department of Labor to analyze the collected survey data. Having a disability is revealed to be a significant barrier to seeking employment. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, this factor is even more impactful than race. Across 4 different racial categories, white, black, Asian, and Hispanic, people with disabilities were consistently 3 times less likely to be employed. Education level, however, was a significant factor. While the graph shows that people with disabilities were still significantly less likely to be employed than those without disabilities, having had completed at least some college has shown to give those with disabilities greater ability to find employment. This can be shown by comparing the total percentage of employment rates for those with disabilities, in other words, the mean percentage, to the employment rates of those with disabilities who completed at least some college. For those with disabilities who have completed some college or an associate's degree, they are 3.5% more likely to be employed than the average individual of at least 25 years old with a disability. And for those who are able to complete a bachelor's degree or higher, they are 9.6% more likely to be employed. While the employment rates of those with disabilities are still, unfortunately, abysmally low when compared to the statistics of those without disabilities, it is good to see that higher educational pursuits can at least provide a bit more social mobility to those with disabilities. Higher education poses a challenge to people with disabilities because they are a barrier to greater economic opportunity and social mobility, while also being a barrier in and of itself. Factors that make higher education a barrier to social mobility for students with disabilities include a harder time funding their educational pursuits, their disability interfering with the completion of coursework, and a lack of awareness of the rights and resources that are granted to them. When considering funding, Rebecca Moore, in an article for the Youth Advisory Committee of the National Council on Disability, states that students with disabilities are often uniquely disadvantaged when applying for financial aid when certain life circumstances come into play. As a first example, a student may qualify for less financial aid if they are already receiving Social Security payments due to their disability. As a second example, students with disabilities may not be able to complete a degree in the typical amount of time and therefore may not qualify for or lose certain scholarships. This second example expresses a fear that I have personally experienced, since my scholarship only lasts for 4 years and would be forfeited if I had to take a year or semester off due to disability-related issues. Luckily, I did not have to do that. I did not lose my scholarship, and I am almost done with school. Yay. Next, we have cultural diversity. I decided to look at statistics of cultural diversity at Ivy League schools because these schools are prestigious and have notoriously low acceptance rates when compared with other universities in the United States. Additionally, it is an area of the country I would love to work in. According to statistics about the class of 2023 from ivycoach.com, between 11 and 13% of students accepted to Ivy League universities each year come from other countries. The most represented national origins of international students are the United Kingdom, Canada, China, and India. I myself have several friends who are from China or India who have decided to study in the United States. Funnily enough, when I was studying in Dresden, in Germany, I met someone from China who was studying film in Chicago. That just goes to show how globalized the world of higher education really is. When comparing this figure to rates of international students at other American universities, I was surprised to discover that Ivy League schools were on par with other schools in terms of rates of international students. ASU, for example, had 11% of their students coming from other countries to begin their studies in Arizona for the 2018 to 2019 school year. To quantify diversity in this section, I decided to focus on where students come from as opposed to race. Firstly, a slide earlier focused on race, and race alone can tell you very little about a student's cultural background. In addition to national origin, I decided to highlight out-of-state students as well. Anyone who travels across the United States will attest that each state or region of the country has their own distinct culture. According to ivycoach.com, all but 3 Ivy League schools did not have at least one student from each U.S. state graduating in 2020. Princeton came close, however, with students from 49 states. This makes sense, especially for the Ivy League, since New York City is an important and diverse international city, so depending on what you consider to be the New York City metropolitan area, at least 3 Ivy League schools are within that metropolitan area of this very important city. Many international students are concentrated in particular areas of the United States, especially California and states hosting Ivy League schools, for these reasons. However, international student enrollment has been declining overall due to factors such as stricter visa requirements and increased completion from universities in other countries. So as other countries get better universities, students don't see the need to come to the U.S. for school as often because they can just stay in their home countries. One challenge with cultural diversity in higher education is ethnocentrism. Many humanities subjects are typically taught from Eurocentric perspectives. At all Ivy League universities, white students make up either the majority or the plurality of students. Disregard for non-majority cultures is evidenced by diversity statistics because they usually just take race into account. Some schools only report racial statistics in terms of white and non-white. When looking at demographic data reported by the Ivy League schools, not every school reports data according to the same categories. For example, Brown counts Native Hawaiians as a separate category to Native Americans, but Harvard considers both groups to be one category. Controversial issues and policies. Universities and other higher education institutions are microcosms with their own policies. Sometimes these policies can be controversial. The first controversial policy that I would like to highlight are speech codes. When a university adopts a speech code, it is usually an attempt to limit hate speech on campus. While the decision of United States versus O'Brien determined that specific and narrow restrictions on speech may be constitutional, university speech codes rarely abide by this standard and are often challenged and subsequently struck down. In 1989, University of Michigan's speech code was challenged and struck down due to not being specific. Some higher education institutions still have speech codes, however, but these colleges and universities are private institutions rather than public universities. Private colleges are not necessarily beholden to the Constitution and therefore have more freedom to instate speech codes on campuses. Another controversial policy on university campuses, the limitation or banning of homosexual expression. Just as some private institutions are free to instate speech codes, many private institutions today have instated bans on homosexual behavior or homosexual relationships on campus. These private institutions are typically religious colleges. Fundamental evangelical universities such as Bob Jones University and Liberty University have adopted policies that ban non-traditional relationships, including homosexual relationships and relationships involving transgender individuals. These policies seem to conflict with Title IX, a federal policy signed by President Barack Obama, which banned discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. The current administration, however, is not particularly keen to enforce compliance to this policy. I personally find these kinds of bans particularly abhorrent and inherently harmful. I know many people who are homosexual or transgender, and having these kinds of policies in place validates discrimination against them. And this is very harmful, especially for young people. According to the Trevor Project, a support organization for LGBT individuals, suicide is the second leading cause of death among LGBT individuals ages 10 to 24, and LGBT youth are 3 times more likely to contemplate suicide and 5 times more likely to attempt suicide. One may point out that if someone has a problem with policies that restrict expression of such identities, they can just go to a different university. But for some people, this is not always easy or viable due to factors such as location and cost. If I found myself employed by a higher education institution that had such bans on the books, I would do everything in my power to be an ally of the individuals targeted by such policies, whether by fighting the policies or by simply being a supportive force in these students' lives. A third and final controversial policy that will be discussed is affirmative action. Affirmative action policies are those that aim to compensate for negative effects of historical discrimination against disadvantaged groups. With regard to higher education, affirmative action controversies tend to arise concerning college admissions. Supporters of affirmative action policies claim that racial disparities still exist and have not been corrected for, while opponents claim that such policies are no longer needed. According to NPR, specific affirmative action controversies typically spring from selective institutions, in other words, those that reject more applicants than they accept, and such grievances are typically brought forward by white and Asian students. This situation becomes particularly awkward when Asian American students are considered because they are often overrepresented in admissions for selective higher education institutions, despite being a minority racial group in the United States. Many opponents of affirmative action oppose such policies because they can result in disadvantaging individuals of groups that are overrepresented, despite whether that group is a majority or a minority in a society as a whole. Assistive technology. According to a TED Talk given by Jeff Parody, himself a user of assistive technology, there are 2 important aspects to consider when examining the role of assistive technology in improving the lives of people who need them: awareness and cost. Despite losing control of most of his body due to muscular dystrophy, Parody was able to continue partaking in his hobbies of painting and playing video games due to conducting research about the kinds of assistive technology that are available in the world. One moving aspect of the conclusion of his speech was that when companies design technologies that make able-bodied individuals' lives easier, such as self-driving cars or smart home implementations, they can often help individuals with disabilities to a more significant degree by increasing their ability to live and function independently. Parody claims that this concept, inclusive design, is important because it provides benefit to all individuals and makes financial sense for businesses because products that are designed inclusively can be purchased and utilized by a larger proportion of the population. Many assistive technologies are used by higher education students every day. Firstly, I would like to highlight technologies that are so ubiquitous that granting them the label of assistive technology may seem superfluous. However, they certainly do provide much-needed assistance for people with disabilities. For example, built-in tools that check for spelling and grammar mistakes are technologies that can be invaluable for people with dyslexia. The inclusivity in spell check's design and function is clear. It helps all students proofread their essays and emails, but it helps those with dyslexia to an additional degree. This kind of design is important because more and more individuals with disabilities are enrolling in college, and the biggest proportion of this increase is students with hidden disabilities, in other words, psychiatric and cognitive disabilities such as dyslexia, ADHD, and learning disabilities. Because such conditions are psychiatric in nature, they may remain hidden and go untested even by the individuals who are dealing with them. Inclusive design principles ensure benefit for many sections of the population, including those who are not keenly aware of the assistance that such technologies have lent to them over the course of their academic careers. When considering students who have disabilities, higher education students must face a unique challenge that younger students do not: self-advocacy. It can be confusing and embarrassing to attempt to navigate the landscape of seeking adequate help. It can also be scary when costs may be involved, but this factor will be discussed a bit later. All 8 Ivy League universities have a Disability Resource Office, sometimes called Accessibility Services, which I think is a more conscientious naming convention. Arizona State University has a Disability Resource Office as well, the Disability Resource Center, according to which over 5,000 students from across all ASU campuses are registered for DRC accommodations. This office helps to fulfill Section 504's obligations for colleges to help make students with disabilities aware of the accommodations that they are eligible to receive. I myself am registered with the DRC, and while I do not have any assistive technology associated with my accommodations, I am constantly receiving announcement emails from the DRC reminding registered students to secure testing resources, which includes assistive technologies such as exclusive ebook and audiobook formats for texts. Costs can often be an obstacle for securing accommodations, and this is especially true for higher education students due to them being adults, many of whom are self-sufficient. Whether the accommodation in question involves alternative format texts, motorized wheelchairs, or prescription medication, students may have to pay for these accommodations themselves. Sometimes medication is covered by health insurance, but this is not the case for every medication nor every location. For example, Cigna has separate drug lists for 10 different states. This can be a chaotic challenge for students who move from one state to another, as many college students do. One may find that upon moving to a particular state, their health insurance coverage may no longer apply to the medications they need to be successful. According to a poll conducted by Brown University, 23% of undergraduate students were found to have been prescribed psychiatric medication for disorders such as depression, anxiety, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and schizophrenia. And according to the Director of Counseling and Psychological Services of Brown, these findings are consistent with similar statistics for other colleges around the country. Psychiatric medications are not often thought of as being assistive technologies, but they can help people to achieve independence and success, just like more overt examples of assistive technology can. Motivation and behaviors. College can be a huge hurdle for an individual. While it can be hard to find the right funds and books, finding motivation may be the most burdensome hurdle. As an educator currently in high school and middle school, motivating my students can be a huge challenge, especially since they are online students. Being a successful online student requires plenty of self-motivation and self-efficacy, and this also holds true for adult students enrolled at colleges and universities, whether they are online or not. In my place of work, we focus strongly on multi-tiered systems of supports, MTSS, and positive behavioral interventions and supports, PBIS, which have been used to great effect to increase retention and graduation rates. When looking online for evidence of these two methods being utilized in the realm of higher education, I was unable to find any evidence. According to my research, universities have come up with different methods for increasing student retention, graduation, and overall success. A meta-analysis and educational review examines the effects of 3 different measures: academic probation, mentoring, and need-based grants. The first, academic probation, serves to motivate students by providing a negative consequence that they would want to avoid. Mentoring aims to provide students with access to information and guidance provided by an experienced faculty member or professional to a student protege. The final examined method, need-based grants, functions as an incentive for students to continue through their higher educational pursuits by augmenting the benefits of continuing with school in the face of the alternative, saving money by dropping out. All of these methods aim to achieve the ultimate goal of educational interventions: retention. Academic probation is a system implemented in most North American universities that hangs a daunting negative consequence over the heads of students and serves to weed out students who are not capable of completing school. This may seem harsh, but this ensures that students who struggle to an insurmountable degree are not wasting their time and money by trying to futilely trudge through a higher education program. This system is a double-edged sword, for while it can jumpstart successful habits for many students, it does of course result in higher dropout and dismissal rates for students who struggle to meet the GPA benchmarks established as a threshold for avoiding academic probation. As a result, some students will become motivated to perform better, and many will turn to other support systems offered by their schools, such as tutoring. Unfortunately, it has been revealed that students may be equally likely to give up. The school that I currently work at, despite being a high school and middle school, uses some kind of academic probation to get students to become more motivated, and based on my personal experience, it does appear to be effective in motivating students to care about their academic performance a little more, and at the very least gives them an incentive to stay in contact with their teachers and tutors. Unfortunately, the ubiquity of academic probation in the United States and Canada, along with blatantly flawed empirical methodologies, means that there is little evidence that exists to validate or invalidate the effectiveness of academic probation in motivating students and reinforcing behaviors. Mentoring involves a more experienced individual imparting knowledge and wisdom onto a less experienced protege. This is very valuable in higher education, especially because it is something that is used a lot in the workforce. When dealing with higher education, one must remember that they are dealing dealing with adults. And so a lot of pedagogical strategies, teaching children, are not going to be as effective as andragogical approaches, teaching adults. Children and adults do not think the same, so when you're trying to motivate adults, don't try to motivate adults the same way you would try to motivate children. The reason why mentoring is really good for adults is because andragogy relies a lot on autonomy and collaboration, which are aspects of learning that adults really like. And mentoring takes advantage of both of these very well. Finally, it is no question that cost is a huge factor that influences student retention in higher education. This is especially true for higher education students in the United States, who are faced with notoriously high fees. The philosophy behind need-based grants is to alleviate financial pressures so that students can focus more on their education. As an example provided by Snyers and DeWitt, if a student has to work in order to cover costs incurred by their education, then providing a need-based subsidy can allow them the freedom to spend more time studying than working, thereby increasing their capacity to be successful academically. This too, however, is a double-edged sword, for it is acknowledged that students who receive this financial aid are not guaranteed to be managing their time effectively, and these payments can even have an adverse effect on student success, since students may continue to enroll in courses despite repeatedly flunking them in order to secure the financial benefits of these subsidies. Therein lies the problem of motivation. As hard as we educators try to encourage our students to be motivated, motivation and new productive behaviors can only take root if a student is willing to let them be planted. And finally, mediation and collaboration. I'm going to summarize a lot of the information on this slide more so than I have before because I feel like it could be covered pretty quickly. So the traditional approach to conflict management is very costly in time and resources because it's a lot more official and a lot more lawsuits and litigation were traditionally used to settle disputes relating to universities. But starting in the late 1970s, there was a movement for more alternative dispute resolution approaches, which are conveniently named Alternative Dispute Resolution, or ADR. When this idea gained traction, it gained traction very quickly. There was a lot of research done on alternative dispute resolution methods, and it turned out to be a very positive thing, and a lot of universities were settling disputes more effectively and saving money. The purview of ADR encompasses many services and strategies, the most prevalent of which is mediation, the scope of which covers on-campus and off-campus disputes concerning students and or faculty. While mediation mirrors the traditional approach in its involvement of a third party to settle disputes, the aim of mediation in the context of ADR is about encouraging collaboration and salvaging community relationships rather than passing judgment of right and wrong. Ideally, parties will be able to resolve their dispute collaboratively with minimal input or reliance on the mediator. Aside from campus disputes, colleges and universities around the United States have offered mediation services to students struggling with off-campus issues such as disputes between a student and their landlord, between a student and a loved one, or between a victim and an abuser in a process known as restorative justice. Mediation services are still provided by student resource and human resource offices in universities and workplaces to this day with great effect. However, when mediation fails to prompt parties to reach a constructive collaborative conclusion, arbitration may be necessary. The big difference between arbitration and mediation is that in arbitration, the third party can make a decision that is binding and does not necessarily conform with the wishes of either party. If the parties can't agree, then the arbitrator makes a decision and everyone just has to deal with it. If there is still no agreement, then you might have to actually go to litigation. But nowadays, most issues don't end up going to litigation because ADR is so effective. You can get people to come together, have a mediated discussion, and reach a conclusion. And here are my references. There are a lot of them, and thank you.